Welcome back to the ChessGoals YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to go over VIP member Birdsell's game. He's playing the black pieces. If you're interested in joining ChessGoals, check out the links in the description below. It's an awesome community for chess improvers. So we have Birdsell here with the black pieces, d4, d5, c4, e6. Birdsell says in his notes, he's going back to the Queen's Gambit declined, switching over from the triangle Slav, and he feels like he has a better handle on the positions. But Birdsell owns the Triangle Slav course. He owns the Dynamic Slav course from ChessGoals. Birdsell, I don't even know what to say to this. All right, so we see knight to c3 by white, knight f6, and this is all standard development, and the Queen's Gambit declined. Yep, this is all pretty much book moves. And the first move that I have a recommendation on is right here. We see pawn to c5 by Birdsell, and he mentions in the notes, is this going too soon for a pawn break? I don't think it's necessarily too soon, but the way I prefer to play this is d takes c4, and after bishop takes c4, playing a6. And the reason I like this setup is because b5 comes with a tempo, and then you're going to get a quick c5 bishop to b7 coming up next. So let's say castle, b5, that bishop drops back, c5. I think it's already a nice position for black, maybe even a slight advantage. So I really like this move order. Take on c4 and then look to play c5. I think in the position it's okay to play c5 in the game position. But if white plays c takes d, for example, here, if e takes d5 is played, now black will essentially have to accept the isolated queen pawn. And I think that's a position that you probably want to avoid unless you have a lot of experience with the isolated pawn. And in this case, I don't think black really has any compensation for it. So that's why I would recommend always take c4 first. I can't really think of any scenarios where white already has d4 and c4 against this pawn on d5 where I wouldn't recommend taking this before playing c5. I really don't like setting up the four pawns in the center like that from the black side when white has the option of what to do first. So that was long-winded, but that's my recommendation. After c5, queen to b3, I think here white could play c takes d and try to create that isolated pawn scenario. b6 was played, bringing the bishop out to b7, potentially even a6. C takes d, c takes d. Very nicely done, Birdsell. You're avoiding the isolated queen pawn, using tactics, and we see that white king's still on e1. That's important, so if the position opens up too much, tactics will tend to favor black. E takes d4 was played, and now white's going to be the one stuck with the isolated queen pawn. Knight takes d5. This is a nice move because the bishops are lined up, so if white tries to avoid having the isolated queen pawn, or at least create a scenario where both sides have an isolated pawn, black does not have to take the knight. Black can play bishop takes g5, and after knight takes g5, queen takes g5, the knight is under attack and the pawn on g2 is under attack from the queen. So now white has to play a move like knight to e3, knight f6, and we see white is stuck with the isolated queen pawn in the end. So going back to the game position, after knight takes d5 for black, I think white has to accept the IQP no matter what. And I really think that was a nice choice by Birdsell. So we see bishop takes e7, knight takes back, castle. Now, what are the typical plans in an isolated queen pawn position? Usually the side with the isolated queen pawn has a little bit more space, and that leads to some attacking chances. The side that's playing against the isolated queen pawn tends to be a bit more passive, the position's more reserved, and they want to play solid, look for trades, and maybe create dual threats, like one threat on the isolated queen pawn, one threat on something else, and try to keep the opponent defending everything at the same time. So in this position, I think Birdsell played a really smooth mid-game to end-game against the isolated queen pawn, and I only have a few notes to make along the way. So let's see what he does. Bishop to b7, bishop to e4. White's voluntarily offering a trade of those bishops. That d3 bishop that moved to e4 was a potential attacker for white. And usually with the isolated queen pawn position, you want that bishop that points at h7 or h2, depending on what color you are. White should try to keep that bishop on the board usually. So we see this trade occur. knight to d5. Textbook, blockading the isolated queen pawn. So not only do you want to attack the pawn, you also want to control the square in front of it. That's exactly what Birdsell is doing. That knight on d5 is very nice. Rook e1. Birdsell brings the other knight to f6, supporting the knight on d5. Rook ac1, rook c8. Knight takes, queen takes, knight e5. This is a nice IQP type move. It's utilizing the fact that this pawn is on d4 and it's not easy to kick the knight on e5. And that knight does create some problems. Look at all these squares it controls in the black position. Just slightly annoying. Now this is a move that I think could be improved upon. Rook takes c1 was played. I don't like rook takes c1 because after white takes back, white controls the only open file on the board. So even though that's the typical IQP plan, as we know, there are exceptions to every rule. And even though black has like a half a pawn advantage here, according to Stockfish, I would rather see you play queen to f4 because I think now you have a larger advantage than half a pawn. Like maybe you're pushing towards a one pawn advantage and you have this dual threat, c1 and d4. And at this point, if white moves the rook to d1, now you can play rook c7, double the rooks, and you have full control of the open file, while the knight is sitting here whinnying. What can I say? The knight is on a stable square. Okay, get it? Stable. That's the last horse pun. Now let's go back to the game. So we had rook takes c1, rook takes c1. Now queen to f4, nice move. Queen d1, queen to e4. So I really like that Birdsell's staying active here. Queen d3, queen f4, attacking the rook. Queen d1, h6. This is a good practical decision. Making room for the king so that there's never a back rank checkmate threat. I'm definitely okay with pawn to h6 here. Knight to c4, and that's actually an inaccuracy by white. So h6 kind of encouraged white to make an inaccuracy here. Pawn to g3 would be better for white, kicking the queen and also making an escape square for the white king later on. Okay, so knight to c4 was played, rook to c8, knight back to e3, another small mistake by white. Now I think rook takes c1 was a good decision because Birdsell's able to pick up the d-pawn. So now Birdsell's in conversion mode, went from an IQP with some active play to now a position where he's up a pawn. There's really no counterplay for white. And the important thing here is to just make sure that he doesn't lose a pawn, Birdsell that is, and try to push this additional pawn that's a potential passed pawn that we want to try to get moving up the board. So white trades, queen takes back. I think that's a good decision. And now, like I was mentioning, it's all about this extra pawn. Queen c8 check, the king moves, queen c2, pawn blocks, that looks good. Queen c3, pawn blocks, this all looks good. And now we see queen to d1 is a back rank mate. White needs to get out of that. And white decides to play king to f1, which is a blunder. Queen to d1 check. Birdsell finds the best move, and after queen to e1, Birdsell, you can take this queen. Queen takes e1, and after king takes back, play e4 and bring your king up into position. Sometimes these are hard to calculate, or actually you could even start maybe with king to f6. Sometimes these are hard to calculate because it's so exact, right? And you want to make sure you have time to know you're winning. But essentially in a king and pawn endgame like this, unless it's a race where a pawn's getting captured on each side, back and forth, when you have control like this and there's pawns on both sides, you can be very confident you're winning as long as none of your pawns are stuck. So in this case, you have the extra pawn, you can create a passer, and then you can do what Jeremy Silman calls fox in the chicken coop, and you can like push that pawn up the board with the help of your king, and then sacrifice that pawn, and then go to one of the flanks with your king to attack the remaining white pawns. So for example, f3, e takes f, king takes, f5, king e3, g5, g3. Now you could play f4 check. And if takes, king here, now you reach this scenario where essentially the pawns are all going to get locked up, and you can do the fox in the chicken coop technique. So let's say white plays b4 here, just for example. b5, h3, h5, h4, a6. Now the white king has to move. As soon as it goes back, our king moves up. In this case, you don't actually even need fox in the chicken coop, because what'll happen is this king is going to run out of squares back here. You can actually stalemate the king, make white push the pawn, take, and then run this pawn all the way up for the checkmate. So that's a really nice way to end the position. But what I have to show, we need to fast forward this game a bit, because what I have to show is the very end. So white ends up delaying the resignation. The queen trade does occur in a couple moves, so now Birdsell's got the winning king and pawn endgame. White avoids the resignation. And this was great technique, Birdsell. It's actually what we just looked at, so I don't know why I had to show that. Birdsell, you're already teaching us. All right, so that pawn gets all the way up the board. White eventually has to sacrifice. And now in this position, black to move, Birdsell gets to play a move that we don't see very often. It's an under promotion to a bishop for the checkmate. What a cool finish by Birdsell. All right, so this was the member game, Birdsell. Yeah, I think the main takeaways were in the opening, looking to play d takes c4 followed by c5. If we go back to that point right here, d takes c first. Otherwise, I think Birdsell, you played a really smooth game. I love the way you played against that isolated queen pawn. I thought it was very instructive. And I think there were only a couple small things along the way. So great game by Birdsell. This was a member game analysis. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.